The call came during my lunch break at Pacific Tech Solutions, just as I was unwrapping my turkey sandwich at my desk. The number wasn't in my contacts, but something made me answer anyway. "Is this Jessica Chen?" The voice was gruff but kind, with a slight Brooklyn accent that seemed out of place in Riverside. "Yes. This is Jessica. Who's calling?" "This is Tony from Golden State Pawn and Jewelry on Maple Grove. I got your number from the inscription inside a ring that was brought in this morning. Says forever yours, Marcus, with all my love. Ring any bells?" My sandwich fell from my hands, landing with a soft thud on my keyboard. The diamond engagement ring Marcus had proposed with 8 months ago, my grandmother's ring that had been in my family for 3 generations, was sitting in a pawn shop. The same ring I'd watched him carefully place in our bedroom safe just last week, after I'd taken it off to do dishes. "There must be some mistake," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the office air conditioning. "Look, lady, I've been doing this for 30 years. When someone brings in a ring this nice and I see a personal inscription, I always try to call. Figured you might want to know before it hits the sales floor tomorrow." The room started spinning slightly. Marcus was in San Francisco on a business trip, or at least that's what he'd told me when he left yesterday morning, with his overnight bag and promises to bring back my favorite sourdough bread from Fisherman's Wharf. "Can you describe the person who brought it in?" I managed to ask, though I already knew the answer would shatter what remained of my afternoon. "Tall guy, dark hair, expensive suit, had a BMW key fob, seemed nervous, kept checking his phone, said it was his grandmother's ring, and he needed cash for a family emergency." Marcus's BMW, Marcus's height, Marcus's nervous habit of constantly checking his phone, but it wasn't his grandmother's ring. It was mine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sat frozen at my desk for several minutes after Tony hung up, staring at the phone screen as if it might somehow display a different conversation. Around me, my coworkers continued their normal Tuesday routines, discussing weekend plans and complaining about the latest software updates, completely unaware that my world had just tilted off its axis. My hands trembled as I opened my laptop and navigated to our joint checking account. Marcus had suggested we combine finances 6 months ago, saying it would make wedding planning easier. Now I wondered what else it had made easier for him. The account showed a balance that made my stomach drop. What should have been nearly $15,000 was down to $312. $312 in an account that had been healthy and growing just last week. I scrolled through the recent transactions, each entry feeling like a small knife wound. Cash withdrawals I didn't remember, payments to companies I'd never heard of, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. The most recent transaction was from this morning, a cash withdrawal of $800 from an ATM in downtown Riverside. Marcus wasn't in San Francisco. He was here in our city, pawning my grandmother's ring while I sat at work believing his lies about business meetings and sourdough bread. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus himself as if summoned by my discovery. "Miss you already. Meeting's running long but should be back tomorrow evening. Love you." The casual normalcy of his message, complete with a heart emoji, felt like a slap across the face. I pushed back from my desk and walked quickly to the bathroom, grateful that the software development floor was mostly empty during lunch hour. In the mirror I looked pale and shaken, my dark hair slightly disheveled from running my hands through it. My usually composed professional appearance cracked around the edges. The woman staring back at me looked like someone whose life was falling apart, which I supposed was exactly what she was. Taking deep breaths, I tried to think rationally. There had to be an explanation. Marcus was successful, his marketing consultancy was doing well, at least according to him. We lived modestly in my apartment, split expenses fairly, and he'd never mentioned money problem. He drove a nice car, wore expensive clothes, and frequently talked about our future plans with the confidence of someone whose finances were secure. But as I stood in that sterile office bathroom, fragments of recent conversations began reassembling themselves in my mind with new context. Marcus's reluctance to discuss specific wedding vendors because they were too expensive right now, his suggestion that we postpone the honeymoon we'd planned to Italy, claiming his business required his attention through the summer. The way he'd become evasive when I'd mentioned wanting to start looking at houses together, saying the market wasn't right for buying. I returned to my desk and called Golden State Pawn back. Tony answered on the second ring. "It's Jessica Chen again. I need to know more about this ring situation. Figured you might call back. Look, I haven't processed it yet, which means technically it's still redeemable if the original owner comes back with the ticket and the money, but between you and me, the guy who brought it in didn't seem like he was planning on coming back." "How much did he get for it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. $1,200 cash. It's worth a lot more than that. Probably 4 or 5 times that amount retail, but pawn value is always lower. He seemed happy enough with the amount. Didn't try to negotiate or anything. $1,200, my grandmother's ring, with its delicate platinum setting and perfectly clear 2-carat diamond, sold for $1,200, the same ring Marcus had proposed with, claiming he'd chosen it specially for me, that it represented our future together. Now I realized he'd probably chosen it because it was valuable and accessible, sitting in my jewelry box like a convenient ATM for whatever financial crisis he was facing. "Tony, I need to ask you something, and please be honest with me. In your experience, when someone brings in an engagement ring like this, what's usually going on?" There was a pause and I could hear him sigh deeply. "Kid, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but it's usually one of 3 things: drug debt, gambling debt, or they're planning to run. Sometimes it's all 3. The words hit me like ice water. Marcus didn't use drugs, at least not that I knew of. But gambling, I thought about his recent trips to Las Vegas with his business partner Brad, trips he claimed were for networking and client entertainment. I thought about his phone calls that he'd take in the other room, claiming they were work-related, but often happening late at night or early in the morning, when no legitimate business would be conducting calls. "Is there any way I can get the ring back?" I asked. "If you can prove it's yours and pay the loan amount, plus fees." "Yeah, but you'd need to move fast. Once it goes on the sales floor tomorrow, it becomes a lot more complicated." I checked my personal savings account on my phone. I had enough to cover the $1,200, barely, but it would wipe out most of my emergency fund. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to create a financial emergency to solve the one Marcus had apparently already created. "I'll be there in an hour," I told Tony. "I'll hold it for you," he promised. "And Jessica, I'm sorry this is happening to you. You seem like a nice person." After hanging up, I sat staring at my computer screen, the software code I'd been working on now looking like meaningless symbols. My mind was racing with questions and implications. If Marcus was desperate enough to pawn my engagement ring, what else was he capable of? What other lies had he told me? What other financial damage had he done that I wasn't aware of yet? I thought about our relationship over the past 3 years, searching for signs I might have missed. Marcus had always been the one to handle restaurant bills and larger purchases, insisting it was more efficient than splitting everything. He'd encouraged me to focus on my career while he managed the business side of our relationship. Now I wondered if that had been less about chivalry and more about control, keeping me unaware of financial realities that might have raised red flags. The text from Marcus about missing me and his fake business meetings felt like a mockery now. While I'd been working hard at my job, contributing to our joint account and planning our future wedding, he'd been living some kind of double life that required pawning my family heirlooms to sustain. I grabbed my purse and headed for the elevator, telling my supervisor I had a family emergency and needed to leave early. It wasn't entirely a lie. This felt like the biggest emergency my small family of one had ever faced. The drive to Golden State Pawn took me through parts of Riverside I rarely visited, past strip malls and used car lots that looked nothing like the polished office buildings and upscale restaurants where Marcus and I usually spent our time. The pawn shop sat between a check-cashing place and a discount tire store, its windows covered with security bars and signs advertising We buy gold in multiple languages. Tony turned out to be a compact man in his 60s with kind eyes and calloused hands, exactly the type of person who would call a stranger to return a family ring. The shop smelled like old leather and metal polish, its walls lined with guitars, power tools and jewelry cases, filled with the remnants of other people's financial emergencies. "You must be Jessica," he said as I entered, apparently recognizing the shell-shocked expression I was probably wearing. He led me to a case behind the counter and pulled out a small black velvet box. When he opened it, there was my grandmother's ring, looking somehow smaller and more fragile than I remember. The platinum band caught the fluorescent light, and the diamond still sparkled with the same brilliance that had made me gasp when Marcus had proposed 8 months ago under the gazebo at Riverside Community Park. "It's definitely yours?" Tony asked gently. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Inside the band I could see the tiny inscription my grandfather had added when he'd proposed to my grandmother in 19. Marcus's inscription had been added later, on the outside of the band, a detail that now seemed symbolic of how he'd tried to make something that belonged to my family into something that served his purposes. "I need to pay you and take it back," I said, pulling out my debit card. $1,200 plus a $50 processing fee, Tony said apologetically. "I know it seems like a lot for holding it for a few hours, but those are the rules." As I watched him process the payment, I realized this was just the beginning. If Marcus was desperate enough to steal and pawn my engagement ring, there were probably other financial disasters I hadn't discovered yet. The joint checking account had been nearly emptied, but what about our savings account? What about the money we'd been setting aside for the wedding? What about the credit cards I'd stupidly added him to as an authorized user 6 months ago? Tony handed me the ring box with a sympathetic smile. "I hope everything works out for you, Jessica. And for what it's worth, anyone who would pawn their fiancé's engagement ring without telling her isn't worthy of wearing a ring in the first place." I slipped the ring back onto my finger, but it felt different now. Heavier, somehow weighted down with new knowledge about the man who had put it there. The symbol that had once represented our future together now felt like evidence of his betrayal, a reminder of how naive I'd been to trust him with access to everything I value. Walking back to my car, I pulled out my phone and started making a mental list of everything I needed to check: bank accounts, credit cards, investment accounts, anything Marcus had access to or knowledge of. I needed to understand the full scope of whatever crisis had driven. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Given him to steal from me, and I needed to understand it before he returned from his fake business trip and realized I knew what he'd done. The drive back to the office gave me time to think about next steps. I couldn't confront Marcus yet, not until I knew more about what I was dealing with, but I also couldn't pretend everything was normal when he returned. The text messages about missing me and sourdough bread felt like insults now, casual lies told to someone he thought was too trusting or too stupid to question them. By the time I reached Pacific Tech Solutions, a plan was forming in my mind. I would spend the rest of the afternoon quietly investigating our finances and gathering information. Then I would call the one person I trusted completely to help me figure out what to do next. My best friend Sarah Williams worked as a paralegal at a family law firm and had seen enough relationship disasters to recognize red flags I'd probably missed. But first I needed to know exactly how bad this financial situation was. If Marcus was pawning my jewelry, it meant whatever debts he'd accumulated were serious enough to drive him to desperate measures, and if he was lying about business trips to cover his activities, it meant the deception ran deeper than a single pawned ring. I spent the rest of my workday pretending to debug software while actually checking every financial account I could access. Our joint savings account showed a balance of $0, emptied 3 days ago in a single electronic transfer to an account I didn't recognize. The credit card I'd added Marcus to as an authorized user showed nearly $10,000 in recent charges, mostly cash advances and payments to something called Riverside Development LLC. Each discovery felt like another small betrayal, another lie revealed. Marcus hadn't just pawned my ring in a moment of desperation. He'd been systematically draining our shared resources for weeks, possibly months, while maintaining the pretense of business success and wedding planning. The Marcus I thought I knew, responsible and financially stable, was apparently a fiction he'd created to hide whatever crisis he was actually facing. As 5 o'clock approached and my coworkers began shutting down their computers, I realized that the woman who had answered Tony's phone call at lunch was gone forever. In her place sat someone harder, more suspicious, someone who would never again take a partner's word about business trips or trust joint financial accounts. The transformation felt both necessary and sad, like growing up in the worst possible way. I gathered my things slowly, trying to process everything I'd learned in a single afternoon. Tomorrow Marcus would return from his fake business trip, probably with fake sourdough bread and fake stories about fake meetings. He would expect to find the same trusting fiancé who had kissed him goodbye yesterday morning, the same woman who had been planning their June wedding and dreaming about their future together. Instead, he would find someone who knew about the pawn shop, someone who had seen the emptied accounts and mysterious charges, someone who was finally asking the right questions. The confrontation was inevitable, but first I needed to arm myself with information, and Sarah would help me understand my legal options, but I suspected I would need more than legal advice to untangle whatever web Marcus had woven around our relationship. As I walked to my car in the Pacific Tech parking lot, my grandmother's ring felt solid and reassuring on my finger, a tangible reminder that some things were worth fighting for. Marcus might have thought I was naive enough to never discover his deception, but he had underestimated the determination of a woman who had just learned that the man she planned to marry was willing to steal her most precious possessions to fund his secret life. The real question now was how much more I would discover before this was over, and whether I would have the strength to handle whatever other betrayals were waiting to be uncovered. I drove straight to Sarah's office after leaving the pawn shop, my grandmother's ring, feeling heavy on my finger and my mind spinning with possibilities I didn't want to consider. Sarah Williams had been my best friend since college, and her job as a paralegal at Henderson and Associates Family Law had given her a cynical but accurate view of how relationships could implode when money problems entered the picture. The law firm occupied the third floor of a modern building in downtown Riverside, its glass facade reflecting the late afternoon sun as I pulled into the parking garage. I'd visited Sarah here countless times over the years, but never with the kind of desperate urgency that was driving me now. The elevator ride to the third floor felt endless, each floor number lighting up like a countdown to a conversation I dreaded having. Sarah looked up from her computer as I appeared in her cubicle doorway, and I watched her expression change from pleasant surprise to immediate concern as she took in my appearance. I probably looked as shaken as I felt. "Jess, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I sank into the chair beside her desk, the same chair where I'd sat 8 months ago showing off my engagement ring and babbling excitedly about wedding plans. The irony of the location wasn't lost on me. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me, even if it's not what I want to hear." Sarah swiveled her chair to face me fully, her paralegal instincts clearly activated by my tone. "Okay, if someone you were engaged to pawned your engagement ring without telling you, what would that usually mean?" The color drained from Sarah's face. "Oh Jess, please tell me this is hypothetical." I pulled out my phone and showed her the photo I'd taken of the pawn shop receipt. "Marcus pawned my grandmother's ring this morning while supposedly on a business trip to San Francisco. The pawn shop owner called me because of the inscription inside." Sarah examined the receipt, her expression growing more troubled with each detail she absorbed. $1,200. That's way below value for your ring. Pawn shops usually offer 20 to 30% of retail value, which means he was desperate enough to take whatever they offered without negotiating. That's what I was afraid of. I told her about the emptied bank accounts, the mysterious credit card charges, and the transfers to companies I'd never heard of. With each detail, Sarah's expression grew grimmer. "Jess, this isn't just financial stress or a temporary cash flow problem, this is systematic asset liquidation. In my experience, when someone starts pawning their partner's jewelry and draining joint accounts, they're either feeding an addiction, paying off dangerous debts, or preparing to disappear." The words I'd been dreading to hear hung in the air between us. Sarah had seen enough divorce cases to recognize the warning signs, and her professional assessment carried weight that my own fears and suspicions hadn't quite achieved. "What do I do?" I asked, hating how small and lost my voice sounded. Sarah was already pulling out a legal pad, her paralegal training taking over. "First, we need to document everything. Screenshots of all the account activity, copies of the pawn receipt, records of any loans or credit applications you might not know about. Second, you need to protect any remaining assets immediately. Third, you need to find out exactly what kind of trouble Marcus is in before he gets back from his fake business trip. She paused, studying my face carefully. Jess, I have to ask this, and please don't take it the wrong way. Is there any chance Marcus is involved in something illegal? The pattern you're describing, especially the shell company payments, sometimes indicates money laundering or fraud. The question hit me like a physical blow. Marcus, the man I'd planned to marry in 3 months, involved in criminal activity. It seemed impossible, but then again 24 hours ago it would have seemed impossible that he would steal my engagement ring. I don't know, I admit. Yesterday I would have said absolutely not, but clearly I don't know Marcus as well as I thought I did. Sarah nodded sympathetically. That's unfortunately common. People can maintain double lives for years, especially when they're good at compartmentalization. The Marcus you know at home might be completely genuine, while the Marcus handling finances and business dealings is someone entirely different. She opened her laptop and began typing rapidly. I'm going to run some basic public record searches on Marcus and his business. Sometimes financial problems leave paper trails that partners aren't aware of. Liens, judgments, bankruptcy filings, business lawsuits, that kind of thing. While Sarah worked, I found myself staring out the window at the Riverside skyline, thinking about all the times Marcus had come home from work, claiming successful client meetings and profitable projects. Had any of it been real, or had he been struggling financially while lying to me about his business success? Jess, you need to see this. Sarah's voice was tight with concern. She turned her laptop screen toward me, showing a court filing dated 3 months ago. Marcus's company, Thompson and Associates, is being sued by a former client for breach of contract and fraud. They're seeking $200,000 in damages. My stomach dropped as I read the legal document. The client, a small manufacturing company, alleged that Marcus had taken a substantial upfront payment for a marketing campaign that was never delivered, then used their confidential business information to compete against them with other clients. There's more, Sarah continued, pulling up additional search results. 2 other lawsuits filed in the past 6 months, both alleging similar patterns of behavior. And look at this, a notice of default on the lease for his office space. He's 3 months behind on rent. The image of Marcus I'd carried in my mind, the successful marketing consultant with a thriving business, was crumbling with each new piece of information. The expensive suits, the confident talk about client victories, the BMW he drove, all of it was apparently funded by fraud and lies rather than legitimate business success. Sarah, if he's facing lawsuits totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, why didn't he tell me? We're supposed to be getting married. I would have tried to help, or at least I would have wanted to know what we were dealing with. Sarah's expression was gentle but realistic. Because he probably knew you'd want to postpone the wedding until his legal troubles were resolved, or because he was hoping to resolve everything before you found out, or because he was planning to make these problems your problems once you were married and legally tied to his debts. That last possibility sent a chill through me. Under California's community property laws, marrying Marcus while he was facing substantial financial judgments could make me partially responsible for debts I'd had no part in creating. I need to see our credit reports, I said suddenly. If he's been using my social security number or applying for credit in my name, I need to know before this gets worse. Sarah was already pulling up the website for credit monitoring. Smart thing. Let's check all 3 bureaus and see if there are any accounts or inquiries you don't recognize. The credit reports revealed another layer of betrayal. Marcus had indeed applied for several credit cards using my information, listing our joint income in a way that made me legally responsible for the debt. 2 cards showed balances totaling $15,000, money that had apparently been used for cash advances and payments to the same mysterious companies I'd seen in our bank statements. This is identity theft, Sarah said flatly. Even if you live together and share finances, he can't legally apply for credit in your name without your explicit consent. You could press criminal charges for this alone. I felt overwhelmed by the cascading discovery. In less than 6 hours, I'd learned that my fiancé was facing multiple fraud lawsuits, had stolen and pawned my engagement ring, had emptied our joint accounts, and had committed identity theft by opening credit accounts in my name. The man I'd planned to spend my life with was essentially a stranger. There's something else we need to check,
Sarah said, her expression troubled. Given the pattern of behavior you're describing, we should look into whether Marcus has any history of domestic violence or financial abuse with previous partners. The suggestion made me uncomfortable, but I recognized the wisdom in it. If Marcus was capable of the level of deception I'd already uncovered, what else might he be capable of? Sarah's searches didn't reveal any criminal domestic violence charges, but they did uncover something almost as disturbing.
Marcus wasn't a good man in temporary trouble. He was a predator who had targeted me specifically for my stability and resources. I feel so stupid, I admitted. How did I not see any of this? How did I let someone get so close to me without knowing who they really were? Sarah's expression softened. Because he's good at what he does, Jess. Financial predators are experts at reading people and telling them exactly what they want to hear. They study their targets, learn their vulnerabilities, and construct personas that are irresistible to their specific victims. This isn't your fault. She gathered the papers we'd printed and organized them into a folder. Tomorrow, you're going to meet with David Rodriguez and develop a legal strategy for protecting yourself. Tonight, you need to go home and act normal. Don't let Marcus know you've discovered anything when he calls or texts. We need time to build our case before he realizes his deception has been exposed. The idea of pretending everything was fine when Marcus called that evening felt almost impossible, but I recognized the strategic necessity. If he suspected I knew about his activities, he might take steps to hide evidence or make the financial damage worse. What if he asks about my day? What if he wants to video chat and notices I'm upset? Sarah considered this. Tell him you're fighting off a cold and don't want to get him sick when he comes home. That gives you an excuse to seem tired and avoid video calls. Keep any conversation short and focused on his fake business trip. As we prepared to leave the office, Sarah handed me the folder containing all the evidence we'd gathered. Guard this carefully. Make copies and store them somewhere. Marcus doesn't have access. And Jess, change all your passwords tonight. Bank accounts, email, social media, everything. If he's been monitoring your communications, he might know more about your activities than you realize. The thought that Marcus might have been spying on my digital communications added another layer of violation to everything else I'd discovered. How long had he been planning this exploitation? How much of our relationship had been genuine versus calculated manipulation? Walking to our cars in the downtown parking garage, I felt like I was inhabiting someone else's life. This morning I'd been Jessica Chen, software developer and happy fiancé, planning a June wedding and excited about building a future with someone I love. Tonight, I was Jessica Chen, fraud victim and identity theft survivor, trying to figure out how to protect myself from the man I'd trusted most in the world. Are you okay to drive? Sarah asked, studying my face with concern. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. I need to get home and start changing passwords and securing my accounts. The sooner I can limit his access to my financial information, the better. Sarah gave me a fierce hug. You're going to get through this, Jess. You're stronger than you know, and you have people who care about you. Marcus might have fooled you about who he was, but he made a mistake thinking you'd be easy to destroy. Driving home through the familiar streets of Riverside, I tried to process everything I'd learned in a single afternoon. The Marcus who had proposed to me under the gazebo at Riverside Community Park was apparently a fiction. The man who would return from his fake business trip tomorrow was someone I'd never really met, despite living with him and planning to marry him. But Sarah was right about one thing. Marcus had underestimated me. He'd assumed I would be too trusting or too naive to discover his deception. He'd assumed he could manipulate and exploit me indefinitely without consequences. Tomorrow he would discover exactly how wrong those assumptions had been. The transformation from victim to adversary was beginning, and I was determined to make sure Marcus faced the full consequences of his choices. The question now was whether I had the strength and resources to outmaneuver someone who had been planning this deception far longer than I'd been fighting it. Arriving home to our apartment on Pine Valley Drive felt surreal after everything I'd learned about Marcus's deception. The space we'd shared for over a year suddenly felt foreign and potentially hostile, as if the walls themselves might be hiding secrets I hadn't yet discovered. Every familiar object now seemed suspect. Every shared possession a potential piece of evidence in a fraud I was only beginning to understand. I stood in the foyer for several minutes, just listening to the silence and trying to reconcile this familiar space with the devastating revelations of the afternoon. The apartment still smelled like the vanilla candles Marcus had bought me for Valentine's Day, still contained the framed photos of our happy moments together, still looked like the home of a couple planning their future together. The cognitive dissonance was almost overwhelming. My first priority was securing my financial accounts, so I settled at the kitchen table with my laptop and began the tedious process of changing every password I could think of. Bank accounts, investment accounts, email, social media, credit monitoring services, even my work computer access. With each password change, I felt like I was building a wall between myself and Marcus, protecting what remained of my financial security from further exploitation. As I worked, I noticed details about our shared space that had never seemed significant before. The small home office where Marcus claimed to work on client projects was always kept meticulously organized, but now I wondered what he might be hiding behind that perfect facade. The filing cabinet he'd insisted we needed for important documents was locked, though I'd never questioned why since I assumed it contained business paperwork I wouldn't understand anyway. The locked filing cabinet suddenly seemed like the most important piece of furniture in our apartment. If Marcus was running sophisticated financial fraud schemes, he would need to keep detailed records, contracts, bank statements, and correspondence. Everything Sarah and I had discovered through public record searches was just the surface. The real evidence of his activities was probably sitting 15 feet away from me, locked behind a thin metal door I'd never thought to question. I examined the filing cabinet more closely, noting that it was a high-security model with an electronic lock rather than a simple key mechanism. The kind of cabinet someone would buy if they were storing documents they really didn't want anyone else to access. Marcus had claimed it was for protecting our important papers from theft, but now I realized it was more likely protecting his criminal evidence from discovery. My phone rang, startling me out of my examination of the cabinet. Marcus's name appeared on the screen and I felt my pulse quicken. This would be my first test of acting normal while knowing everything I now knew about his activity. "Hey babe," I answered, trying to keep my voice light and casual. "Hi beautiful, how was your day?" His voice sounded relaxed and affectionate, the same tone he'd used thousands of times before. The fact that he could sound so normal while living this elaborate lie was almost more disturbing than the lies themselves. "Pretty quiet, just work stuff. I think I might be coming down with something though. Feeling kind of run down." Sarah's suggested excuse came naturally, and I was grateful for the cover it provided. "Oh no, I'm sorry honey, make sure you get plenty of rest tonight. I don't want you getting really sick." The casual concern in his voice made my skin crawl. How could he express caring about my health while systematically destroying my financial security? How could he call me beautiful and honey while stealing my grandmother's ring? "How are your meetings going?" I asked, curious to hear how elaborate his lies had become. "Really well, actually. I think we're going to land the Peterson account, which would be huge for the company. The client dinner went late, but it was worth it. They're excited about our digital strategy proposal." I found myself taking notes as he spoke, documenting his lies in real time. There was no Peterson account, no client dinner, no digital strategy proposal. Every word out of his mouth was fiction designed to maintain the illusion of business success, while he was actually pawning my jewelry and emptying our bank accounts. "That's great news," I managed to say. "I'm proud of you for working so hard." "Thanks, babe. That means everything to me. I should be home around 6 tomorrow evening. Maybe we can order dinner from that Thai place you love and I can tell you all about the new contract." More lies, more casual affection, more planning for a future that would never happen. By 6 tomorrow evening, Marcus would be walking into a very different situation than he was imagining. "Sounds perfect," I lied smoothly. "I love you. I love you too, Jess. Get some rest, okay?" After hanging up, I sat staring at my phone, amazed by how easily the lies had flowed from both of us. Marcus had years of practice maintaining this double life, but apparently I was a faster learner than either of us had expected. The realization that I could lie to him as smoothly as he'd been lying to me was both empowering and slightly disturbing. With Marcus safely accounted for in his fake San Francisco hotel room, I decided to explore our apartment more thoroughly. If he'd been conducting financial fraud from our home, there might be evidence I could access without breaking into the locked filing cabinet. I started with his desk drawers, looking for anything that might provide insight into his real activity. The top drawer contained the usual office supplies, but underneath a stack of notepads I found something interesting: a second phone. It was an older model smartphone, turned off and hidden beneath papers in a way that suggested it wasn't meant to be discovered. When I powered it on, it required a passcode, but the lock screen showed dozens of missed text messages and voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. A second phone meant a second lie. Marcus was clearly conducting business or personal relationships that he needed to keep completely separate from his interactions with me. The phone represented another layer of deception, another carefully maintained boundary between his real activities and the life he'd constructed for my benefit. I tried several obvious passcodes based on dates that might be significant to Marcus, but none worked. The phone would eventually lock me out entirely if I kept guessing, so I set it aside and continued searching the desk. Hidden behind a stack of business cards, I found a small notebook filled with handwritten notes in Marcus's distinctive scrawl. The notebook contained what appeared to be records of gambling activities, dates, amounts, wins and losses, all meticulously documented in a way that suggested serious addiction rather than casual entertainment. The numbers were staggering: losses of $5,000, $8,000, $12,000 on individual days, with occasional wins that never seemed to offset the mounting losses. The gambling records explained everything. Marcus wasn't conducting elaborate business fraud for profit or lifestyle. He was feeding a gambling addiction that had spiraled completely out of control. The pawned ring, the emptied accounts, the identity theft, all of it was desperate attempts to fund continued gambling while maintaining the appearance of financial stability. As I flipped through pages of gambling records, I began to understand the timeline of Marcus's deception. The notebook went back almost 2 years, showing a progression from small losses to increasingly desperate financial measures. The early entries showed modest casino visits with losses in the hundreds of dollars. By the middle of the notebook, the losses were in the thousands, and the later entries showed the creative financing that had ultimately led to stealing from me. One entry from 3 months ago caught my attention. Jennifer Loan, $20K, told her it was for business expansion. Jennifer Walsh, the woman who had filed the restraining order against Marcus for financial harassment. He'd borrowed $20,000 from her to fund his gambling, then disappeared when she demanded repayment. The same pattern he was now executing with me, just on a larger scale. Another entry from 6 weeks ago was even more chilling. Joint account access secured, can move funds without questions. Marcus had been planning to steal from our shared accounts for over a month, methodically setting up access and justifying his future thefts to himself in writing. The most recent entries showed his desperation escalating rapidly. Ring should bring 100 at Golden State was written 3 days ago, followed by need to hit big at Riverside Casino to clean up before wedding. He'd been planning to pawn my engagement ring for days, and he was delusional enough to think he could win enough gambling to repair the financial damage before our June wedding. I photographed every page of the notebook with my phone, creating evidence that clearly documented Marcus's gambling addiction and his systematic plan to steal from me. This notebook alone would be enough to support criminal charges for theft and fraud, but I suspected there was much more evidence hidden in that locked filing cabinet. Moving to Marcus's closet, I searched through his expensive suits and found several Casino Players Club cards in the pocket. Riverside Casino, Thunder Valley, Cache Creek, even some from Las Vegas casinos I'd never heard of. The cards were worn and frequently used, suggesting that gambling was a regular activity rather than occasional entertainment. In the bathroom medicine cabinet, hidden behind cold medicine and vitamins, I found a small bottle of prescription anxiety medication prescribed to someone named David Thompson, not Marcus Thompson, but David Thompson, with an address I didn't recognize. Either Marcus was using a false identity to obtain prescription drugs, or he was buying medications illegally from someone else with a similar addiction problem. Each discovery added another layer to the web of deception Marcus had constructed around his gambling addiction. He wasn't just stealing money to fund his habit, he was maintaining false identities, obtaining prescription drugs under fake names, and conducting elaborate schemes to hide his activities from everyone in his life, including the apartment I'd thought of as our shared home was actually Marcus's operations center for a complex fraud designed to fund his gambling while maintaining the appearance of success and stability. Every room contained evidence of his deception, hidden in plain sight behind the facade of a normal domestic life. My exploration was interrupted by a text message from the second phone I'd discovered. The screen lit up with a preview. Payment overdue. Need to discuss consequences. Rico. The message was automatically deleted after a few seconds, but not before I'd taken a screenshot. Someone named Rico was apparently waiting for payment from Marcus, and the tone suggested it wasn't a casual business debt. I tried to access the full message history on the second phone, but it remained locked behind the passcode I couldn't crack. However, the brief preview had revealed something important. Marcus wasn't just dealing with casino debts and civil lawsuits. He was apparently involved with people who used phrases like discuss consequences when payments were overdue. The implications sent a chill through me. If Marcus owed money to dangerous people, my association with him could put me at risk even after I exposed his fraud and ended our relationship. The locked filing cabinet might contain information about debts and creditors I needed to know about for my own safety. I spent the next hour searching every possible hiding place in our apartment, looking for keys, combination codes, or additional evidence. Behind books on our bookshelf, I found several pawn shop receipts for items I didn't recognize, including expensive watches and jewelry that had apparently belonged to Marcus. He'd been systematically liquidating his personal possessions for months before moving on to stealing mine. In the pocket of a jacket I'd never seen him wear, I found a business card for a bankruptcy attorney in Los Angeles. The card was worn and handled frequently, suggesting Marcus had been considering bankruptcy as an option for dealing with his debt. The fact that he'd consulted with an attorney 4 hours away in Los Angeles, rather than locally, suggested he was trying to keep his financial problems secret from anyone in Riverside who might know him. As evening approached, I realized I'd transformed our apartment into a crime scene, with evidence of Marcus's deception spread across every surface. The comfortable home we'd shared had become a museum of betrayal, each room telling part of the story of how someone I'd trusted had systematically exploited that trust for nearly 2 years. The locked filing cabinet remained the most tantalizing piece of the puzzle. Everything I'd found so far was circumstantial evidence of gambling addiction and financial fraud, but that cabinet likely contained the detailed documentation that would reveal the full scope of Marcus's activity. Bank statements, loan documents, correspondence with creditors, maybe even information about the mysterious Rico who was waiting for overdue payments. I considered trying to force the cabinet open, but the electronic lock was too sophisticated for amateur breaking and entering. Instead, I focused on documenting everything I'd already found, creating a comprehensive photographic record of Marcus's deception that I could present to David Rodriguez tomorrow morning. As I organized my evidence, I realized that the apartment search had accomplished something beyond gathering information. It had completed my emotional separation from Marcus in a way that abstract financial records couldn't achieve. Seeing the physical evidence of his lies scattered throughout our shared space had destroyed any lingering hope that this might be a misunderstanding or a temporary crisis. The man who would return tomorrow evening wasn't my fiancé coming home from a business trip. He was a gambling addict and financial predator returning to a crime scene where his victim had finally discovered the truth. The comfortable illusion of our relationship was gone, replaced by the stark reality of evidence and documentation that would soon become the foundation of criminal charge. My phone buzzed with another text from Marcus's regular phone. Sweet dreams, beautiful, can't wait to see you tomorrow and tell you about all the exciting opportunities coming our way. I stared at the message,
amazed by his continued performance of affection and optimism. Even now, while facing overdue payments to people who discussed consequences, while having pawned my family ring and emptied our accounts, he was still maintaining the fiction of a successful businessman excited about the future. The text represented everything that was wrong with Marcus's character, not just the lying and stealing but the casual cruelty of expressing fake love to someone he was systematically victimizing. Tomorrow, when he walked through our apartment door expecting to find the same trusting fiancé he'd left behind, he would instead face the consequences of underestimating exactly who he'd chosen to betray. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I prepared for what I knew would be one of the most difficult days of my life. I'd barely slept, my mind racing through everything I'd discovered and trying to prepare for the confrontation that was inevitable when Marcus returned from his fake business trip. But first I needed professional help to navigate the legal and financial maze he'd created. David Rodriguez's office was located in a converted Victorian house near downtown Riverside, its warm wood paneling and comfortable furniture designed to put distressed clients at ease. I arrived 15 minutes early, clutching the folder of evidence I'd compiled and trying to project more confidence than I actually felt. Sarah had already briefed David about my situation, so when his assistant showed me into his office, he was prepared with legal pads, a tape recorder and the kind of focused attention that told me he understood the seriousness of what I was facing. Ms. Chen, Sarah has given me the basic outline of your situation, but I'd like to hear the details directly from you. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out, no matter how minor it might seem. David Rodriguez was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent years helping people navigate the worst moments of their lives. His office walls were covered with certificates and awards, but also with thank you letters from grateful clients, suggesting he was both competent and genuinely caring about the people he represented. I told him everything, starting with Tony's phone call about the pawned ring and continuing through all the discoveries I'd made about Marcus's gambling addiction, financial fraud and systematic deception. David took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just listening with the focus of someone building a legal strategy in real time. When I finished my account, David sat back and studied his notes for several minutes before speaking. Jessica, what you're describing isn't just marital fraud or financial infidelity. Based on the evidence you've gathered, Marcus has committed multiple felonies, including identity theft, grand theft, and potentially money laundering through those shell company transactions. This is a criminal matter that needs to be reported to law enforcement immediately. The word felonies hit me with unexpected force. I'd been thinking of Marcus's behavior as betrayal and deception, but I hadn't fully processed that he was actually a criminal who belonged in prison. The man I'd planned to marry in 3 months wasn't just a gambling addict or a liar, he was someone who had committed serious crimes against me personally. What happens if we involve the police? I asked. Will I be able to recover any of the money he stole? David's expression was realistic but not discouraging. Criminal prosecution is separate from financial recovery, but they often work together. If Marcus is convicted of theft and fraud, the court can order restitution as part of his sentence. However, given his apparent financial situation, actual recovery might be limited unless he has hidden assets we haven't discovered yet. He opened his laptop and began pulling up forms and documents. The first priority is protecting you from further financial damage. We need to freeze all joint accounts, cancel any credit cards he has access to, and put fraud alerts on your credit reports. Then we need to document everything for the police report. While David worked on the legal paperwork, I found myself thinking about how to handle Marcus's return that evening. The original plan had been to act normal until I could gather more evidence, but David's involvement changed the timeline significantly. Should I confront Marcus when he gets back tonight, or wait until after we file the police report? I asked. David considered this carefully. Normally I'd recommend waiting until after we involve law enforcement, but there's a complicating fact. The message you showed me from that second phone, the one about overdue payments and consequences, suggests Marcus might be in danger from his creditors. If he's borrowed money from dangerous people, confronting him at home could put you at risk as well. This possibility hadn't occurred to me, and it added a new dimension to an already complicated situation. I'd been focused on Marcus's betrayal of me, But if he owed money to loan sharks or other criminals, the danger extended beyond financial fraud. What do you recommend? I think we should involve law enforcement today. Before Marcus returns, let the police handle the initial confrontation in a controlled environment where your safety is guaranteed. Once he's in custody, you'll have time to secure your apartment and decide how to proceed without worrying about retaliation. David's assistant knocked and entered with a pot of coffee and some paperwork. As she served the coffee, I noticed her expression was sympathetic but not surprised, suggesting she'd seen plenty of cases like mine. The thought was both comforting and depressing. I've prepared the fraud alert paperwork for all 3 credit bureaus, David's assistant Maria said as she handed me documents to sign. I've also drafted letters to your bank and credit card companies, requesting immediate account freezes, pending resolution of identity theft claim. The efficiency of their response impressed me, and made me grateful for Sarah's recommendation. Clearly David's practice was experienced in handling financial fraud cases, and they had systems in place to move quickly when someone's assets were at risk. David continued outlining our strategy. After we finish the paperwork here, we'll go directly to the Riverside Police Department and file a criminal complaint. I'll accompany you to make sure everything is documented properly, and that the police understand the urgency of the situation. He paused, studying my expression carefully. Jessica, I need to ask you something, and please answer honestly. Is there any chance you want to try to work things out with Marcus? Any possibility you'd consider couples counseling, or debt consolidation instead of criminal prosecution? The question surprised me with its directness, but I appreciated David's need to understand my commitment to legal action before investing time and resources in building a case. No, I said firmly. What Marcus did wasn't a mistake or a cry for help. It was systematic fraud conducted over months while he looked me in the eye every night and told me he loved me. Someone capable of that level of calculated deception doesn't deserve a second chance. David nodded approvingly. That's exactly what I needed to hear. Half-hearted prosecution attempts usually fail because the victim wavers when things get difficult. Criminal cases require complete commitment to seeing justice done. While David and Maria continued preparing legal documents, my phone rang. My brother Kevin's name appeared on the screen, and I realized I hadn't spoken to him since discovering Marcus's betrayal yesterday. Kevin worked in cybersecurity for a tech company in San Jose, and had always been protective of me, especially since our parents died in a car accident 5 years ago. Hey Kev, what's up? Just checking in sis, haven't heard from you in a couple weeks, and wanted to make sure everything's okay with the wedding planning. The irony of his timing was almost painful. Kevin had been the one family member who'd expressed reservations about Marcus from the beginning, noting that something felt off about his financial claims and business success. I'd dismissed Kevin's concerns as overprotective big brother syndrome, but now I wondered if his cybersecurity background had given him insights I'd missed. Actually, Kevin, something's happened, something really bad. Can you come down to Riverside today?
In less than 2 hours, David's office had essentially built a fortress around my remaining financial assets, while preparing a comprehensive legal attack on Marcus's criminal activities. I felt protected for the first time since Tony's phone call yesterday. Before we go to the police station, David said, I want to discuss what happens when Marcus realizes his accounts have been frozen and his fraud has been discovered. He'll likely try to contact you, either to apologize and beg for forgiveness, or to threaten and intimidate you into dropping the charges. This possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. Marcus's entire life was built on maintaining the illusion of success and respectability. Criminal charges would destroy that illusion completely, threatening not just his freedom, but his ability to continue victimizing other people. What should I do if he calls or shows up at my apartment? I asked. Document everything, but don't engage directly. Let all communication go through me, or the police. Any contact he makes after learning about the criminal charges could constitute witness intimidation or harassment, which would add additional charges to his case. David handed me a business card with his emergency contact information. If Marcus contacts you directly, call me immediately regardless of the time. Don't try to handle him yourself, even if he seems apologetic or remorseful. People facing serious criminal charges can become unpredictable. As we prepared to leave for the police station, I found myself thinking about the Marcus I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. That man had seemed kind, successful, and genuinely caring about my happiness and well-being. Now I understood that person had been entirely fictional, created specifically to gain my trust and access my resources. The realization was painful but also liberating. I wasn't losing someone I loved, I was escaping from someone who had never truly existed. The real Marcus was a gambling addict and criminal who had targeted me specifically for exploitation. Understanding that distinction made the prospect of criminal prosecution easier to accept. Kevin arrived at David's office just as we were preparing to leave for the police station. My brother looked exactly like I'd expected, dressed in his usual jeans and tech company polo shirt, but with an expression of barely controlled fury that told me he was taking Marcus's betrayal personally. "Tell me everything," Kevin said without preamble as he hugged me tightly. "What exactly did this piece of garbage do to you?" I gave Kevin a condensed version of everything I'd discovered, watching his expression grow darker with each detail. When I mentioned the second phone and the locked filing cabinet at our apartment, his cybersecurity instincts immediately activated. That second phone is probably the key to understanding his whole operation. Kevin's criminals use burner phones to communicate with creditors, coordinate illegal activities, and maintain separation between their legitimate and criminal personas. If we can access that phone, we'll probably find evidence of everything he's been doing. David was clearly impressed by Kevin's immediate grasp of the technical aspects. "Would you be able to help law enforcement access the phone if they obtain a search warrant?" Kevin nodded confidently. "Definitely. Breaking phone encryption is part of my job, and law enforcement has legal tools for accessing evidence on criminal devices. I can also help analyze any computer files or digital records they find." Having Kevin's technical expertise available made me feel much more confident about the investigation. Marcus might have been clever enough to hide his activities from me, but he'd be no match for professional law enforcement tools combined with Kevin's cybersecurity knowledge. The Riverside Police Department occupied a modern building near downtown, its lobby bustling with officers, civilians, and attorneys handling various cases. David's familiarity with the building and procedures was obvious as he guided us directly to the Financial Crimes Division. Detective Lisa Park greeted us in a conference room equipped with recording equipment and computers for documenting evidence. She was a compact Asian woman in her 40s with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent years investigating financial fraud cases. "Ms. Rodriguez has given me an overview of your situation," Detective Park said as we settled around the conference table. "This appears to be a complex case involving multiple felonies, so I want to make sure we document everything thoroughly." I told my story again, this time with Detective Park asking detailed questions about timelines, amounts, and specific criminal acts. Kevin provided technical context about the digital evidence we'd discovered, while David ensured that everything was documented properly for prosecution. "Based on what you've told me," Detective Park said when I finished, "Marcus Thompson has committed identity theft, grand theft, fraud, and possibly money laundering. The gambling addiction explains his motivation, but it doesn't excuse the criminal behavior." She turned to Kevin. "If we obtain search warrants for the apartment and his business office, would you be available to assist with technical analysis of any digital evidence we recover?" Kevin nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. I can also help you understand any cybersecurity measures he might have taken to hide his activities. Gambling addicts often become sophisticated about concealing their digital trap." Detective Park began preparing search warrant applications, while David explained the process of criminal prosecution. Marcus would be arrested, charged, and required to appear in court, depending on the evidence recovered during searches. Additional charges might be added. The process could take months, but the initial arrest would happen within days. "What about my safety?" I asked. David mentioned that Marcus might be in debt to dangerous people. "Should I be worried about retaliation from his creditors?" Detective Park's expression grew more serious. "That's a valid concern. People who lend money to gambling addicts often use intimidation and violence to collect debts. If Marcus has identified you as a source of money to his creditors, you could become a target even after we arrest him. She pulled out a form and began filling it out. I'm going to recommend a temporary restraining order that prohibits Marcus from contacting you directly or coming within 500 feet of your home or workplace. That won't stop organized criminals, but it creates legal consequences if Marcus tries to pressure you into helping him. The idea that I might need protection from dangerous criminals added another layer of fear to an already overwhelming situation. I thought the worst part was discovering Marcus's betrayal, but apparently the consequences of his gambling addiction could extend far beyond our relationship. Kevin was already thinking tactically. Jessica should probably stay somewhere else for a few days while you execute the search warrants and make the arrest. If Marcus's creditors know where she lives, her apartment might not be safe. David agreed. My office can arrange temporary accommodation through a client services fund we maintain for domestic violence and fraud victims. It's not permanent housing, but it would give you a secure place to stay while law enforcement handles the immediate threat. The speed with which my life was changing felt surreal. Yesterday I'd been planning a June wedding and looking forward to building a future with someone I love. Today I was filing criminal charges, applying for restraining orders, and arranging to go into hiding because my fiancé's gambling debts might have put me in physical danger. Detective Park finished the search warrant applications and handed copies to David for review. We'll execute these warrants tomorrow morning while Marcus is traveling back from San Francisco. That gives us time to search both locations before he realizes what's happening. She turned to me with a sympathetic expression. Jessica, I know this is overwhelming, but you're doing exactly the right thing. Financial predators like Marcus rely on their victims being too embarrassed or confused to fight back. By taking immediate legal action, you're protecting yourself and potentially preventing him from victimizing other people. The comment about other victims reminded me of Jennifer Walsh, the woman who'd filed the restraining order against Marcus 2 years ago. If she'd pursued criminal charges instead of just civil action, Marcus might have been stopped before he could target me. Detective Park, there's a woman named Jennifer Walsh who filed a restraining order against Marcus, and she might be willing to testify about his pattern of financial fraud, if that would help the case. Detective Park made a note to contact Jennifer Walsh for a witness statement. Pattern evidence can be crucial in fraud cases. If we can show that Marcus has a history of targeting women for financial exploitation, it strengthens the prosecution significantly. As our meeting concluded, I realized that the investigation was taking on a momentum of its own. What had started as my personal discovery of betrayal was becoming a comprehensive criminal case that might expose a pattern of predatory behavior spanning several years. Kevin insisted on driving me to my apartment to pack clothes and personal items before relocating to temporary housing. The familiar drive through Riverside felt different now, as if I was seeing the city through the eyes of someone who had narrowly escaped danger rather than someone who called it home. I'm proud of you for handling this so well, Kevin said as we pulled into my apartment complex. A lot of people would have tried to ignore the warning signs or make excuses for someone they loved. I appreciated his support, but I didn't feel like I was handling anything well. I felt confused, betrayed, and frightened about what other discoveries might be waiting. The only thing keeping me functioning was the structure and support David and Detective Park had provided. Kevin, can I ask you something? When you first met Marcus, what made you suspicious of him? You never really explained why you didn't trust him. Kevin considered the question as we walked toward my apartment building. It was a combination of things. His stories about business success never quite added up when I asked technical questions. He was evasive about specifics whenever I tried to understand how his marketing company actually operated, and he was always steering conversations away from money and toward emotional topics. He paused as we reached my door. In cybersecurity, we're trained to recognize social engineering tactics. Marcus was using classic manipulation techniques to avoid scrutiny while building emotional dependency. It felt calculated rather than genuine. I wished I'd listened to Kevin's concerns earlier, but I understood why I hadn't. Marcus had been extraordinarily skilled at creating emotional intimacy while maintaining operational secrecy. His manipulation had been sophisticated enough to fool someone much smarter than me. Inside the apartment, I quickly packed clothes and essential items while Kevin examined the evidence I'd gathered the night before. He was particularly interested in the second phone and the locked filing cabinet. "This phone is definitely law enforcement-grade evidence," he said, carefully handling it with a tissue to avoid disturbing fingerprints. "Whatever's on here is probably the smoking gun that ties Marcus to his criminal network." Kevin also examined the locked filing cabinet with professional interest. "This is a serious security cabinet, the kind used for classified documents. Whatever Marcus is hiding in here, he considered it extremely sensitive. The electronic lock suggests he's probably changed the combination recently to prevent exactly what you're trying to do." As I finished packing, my phone rang with a call from Marcus. Kevin immediately signaled for me to answer it while he started recording with his phone. "Hey babe," Marcus said, his voice cheerful and unsuspecting. "Just wanted to let you know I'm about to board my flight home. Should be back around 6 like I promised. Are you feeling better?" The casual normalcy of his voice was chilling given everything I now knew about his activity. He was still maintaining the fiction of a successful business trip while probably knowing that creditors were looking for him and his theft had been discovered. "I'm feeling a little better," I lied smoothly. "Looking forward to hearing about your meeting. It was a great trip, really productive. I think the Peterson account is going to transform the business. We should celebrate tonight." More lies about fictional clients and imaginary success. Every word out of Marcus's mouth was designed to maintain an illusion that had already been shattered beyond repair. "That sounds wonderful," I managed to say. "I'll see you at 6. After hanging up, Kevin played back the recording on his phone. "Perfect. He's still maintaining the fiction about being in San Francisco, which proves he's actively lying to cover his tracks. That recording will be useful evidence of ongoing deception." We finished gathering my belongings and headed back to David's office, where Maria had arranged temporary housing at a small extended stay hotel near downtown Riverside. The hotel specialized in providing secure accommodation for people in crisis situations, and their staff was trained to handle clients who might be at risk from domestic violence or criminal retaliation. As Kevin helped me settle into the hotel room, I realized that this temporary displacement was probably the beginning of a complete life transformation. Even after Marcus was arrested and prosecuted, I couldn't go back to the life I'd been living. The apartment we'd shared was contaminated by his deception, the future we'd planned was entirely fictional, and the person I'd thought I was in love with had never existed. "What happens next?" I asked Kevin as we sat in the hotel room's small sitting area. "Tomorrow morning, law enforcement executes the search warrants and gathers evidence. Tomorrow evening, Marcus gets arrested when he returns to Riverside. After that, the legal process takes over and you start rebuilding your life." He squeezed my hand reassuringly. "It's going to be hard, Jess, but you're going to come out of this stronger and smarter. Marcus thought he could destroy you, but he picked the wrong target." Kevin was right about Marcus underestimating me. The gambling addict who had systematically stolen from me was about to discover that his victim was much more resourceful and determined than he'd anticipated. Tomorrow would be the beginning of justice, but tonight was the end of the illusion that had nearly cost me everything. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that seemed to match my newfound determination to see Marcus face the consequences of his action. I'd slept better than expected in the hotel room, probably because, for the first time in days, I felt truly safe from the chaos Marcus had created. Kevin had stayed in the adjoining room, and knowing he was nearby had provided a sense of security I hadn't realized I'd been missing. David Rodriguez called at 7 a.m. to confirm that Detective Park's team was ready to execute the search warrants. The timing had been carefully coordinated to ensure Marcus would still be traveling back from San Francisco while law enforcement gathered evidence from both our apartment and his business office. "How are you holding up?" David asked when I answered the phone. "Better than I expected," I replied honestly. "Yesterday I felt like my world was falling apart, but today I feel like I'm taking it back." That's exactly the right attitude. Recovery from financial fraud is as much about reclaiming your sense of control as it is about recovering money or seeing justice done. Kevin and I met Detective Park and her team at the apartment complex at 8 a.m. Watching law enforcement officers enter the space I'd shared with Marcus felt surreal but also validating. The criminal investigation legitimized my feelings of betrayal and violation in a way that private discovery hadn't achieved. Detective Park's team worked methodically through the apartment, photographing everything before searching for evidence. Kevin provided technical guidance on the digital devices they found, including the second phone, and several external hard drives hidden in Marcus's closet. Your fiancé was more sophisticated than most gambling addicts, Detective Park told me as her team worked. He's been maintaining detailed records of his illegal activities, probably because he thought he could eventually win enough money to cover his tracks before anyone discovered what he'd done. The locked filing cabinet required a court-ordered locksmith to open, but when they finally accessed it, the contents exceeded everyone's expectations. Marcus had been keeping meticulous records of his financial fraud going back over 3 years. Bank statements showing systematic theft from multiple victims, correspondence with loan sharks and illegal gambling operations, and detailed plans for expanding his criminal activities. This is a prosecutor's dream, David said as he reviewed the document. Marcus basically created a complete record of his own criminal enterprise. Any defense attorney is going to have a very difficult time arguing innocence when faced with this level of self-documentation. Among the most disturbing documents was a file labeled Targets that contained detailed financial profiles of several women Marcus had been researching for potential exploitation. My profile was there, along with information about my income, savings, and family background that he'd gathered before we even started dating. He targeted you specifically, Kevin said, his voice tight with anger as he read through my file. This wasn't a relationship that developed into financial abuse. This was a planned criminal operation from the very beginning. The revelation was painful but also clarifying. Every moment of our relationship that I'd cherished as genuine had actually been part of an elaborate fraud designed to gain access to my resources. Marcus hadn't gradually become a criminal. He'd been one all along and I'd been his carefully selected victim. Detective Park found additional evidence that explained the consequences message I'd seen on Marcus's second phone. He owed over $80,000 to what appeared to be an organized crime syndicate that specialized in providing gambling credit to addicts. The interest rates were astronomical, and the payment terms included provisions for asset recovery assistance that sounded like euphemisms for violence. Jessica, this confirms our concerns about your safety, Detective Parks. These people know about your relationship with Marcus, and they probably view you as a potential source of payment for his debts. The restraining order is important, but you should also consider staying in secure housing until we can determine the extent of their interest in you. The idea that organized criminals might target me for Marcus's gambling debts added another layer of fear to an already complex situation. I'd been focused on Marcus's betrayal of our relationship, but apparently the consequences extended far beyond personal heartbreak. Kevin was documenting everything with his phone, creating additional evidence that could be used in court. His cybersecurity background made him invaluable in understanding the technical aspects of Marcus's fraud, and his protective big brother instincts were clearly activated by the scope of the betrayal. We need to check your personal accounts for any unauthorized access, Kevin told me as the search continued. If Marcus has been planning this fraud for years, he might have been monitoring your digital communications or accessing your accounts without your knowledge. This possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. Someone sophisticated enough to maintain the elaborate fraud Marcus had constructed would certainly have been monitoring his victims' activities to stay ahead of potential discovery. Detective Park's team found evidence of exactly that kind of surveillance. Marcus had installed keylogger software on our shared laptop and had been monitoring my email and banking activity for over a year. He'd known about every financial transaction I'd made, every email I'd sent, and every online search I'd conducted. This is why he was so confident that his fraud would go undetected.
Kevin realized.
He wasn't just stealing from you blindly. He was monitoring your reactions and adjusting his activities to stay below your threshold of suspicion. The surveillance added a new dimension to Marcus's violation of my trust. Not only had he been stealing my money and lying about our relationship, but he'd been spying on my private communications and thoughts. The apartment I'd considered a safe haven had actually been a surveillance center where my every digital move was being monitored and analyzed. As the search team prepared to move to Marcus's business office, Detective Park received a call that changed the day's trajectory significantly. Marcus's flight from San Francisco had been delayed, and he wouldn't arrive in Riverside until late evening. This gave law enforcement additional time to gather evidence, but it also meant the arrest would happen later than planned. The delay is actually beneficial, David explained, as we prepared to accompany the search team to Thompson and Associates. The more evidence we gather before Marcus realizes what's happening, the stronger our case becomes. Marcus's business office told a story of systematic deception that was even more elaborate than what we'd found at the apartment. The office space was expensive and professionally decorated, clearly designed to impress potential victims, with Marcus's apparent success. But behind the facade, Detective Park's team found evidence of a struggling business that hadn't been profitable in over 2 years. He's been using new client deposits to pay existing expenses and gambling debts, Detective Park explained as her team examined financial records. It's classic Ponzi scheme behavior, taking money from new victims to cover obligations to previous victims, while skimming funds for personal use. The business records showed that Marcus had defrauded at least 6 different clients over the past 2 years, taking substantial upfront payments for marketing services that were never delivered. The amounts totaled over $200,000, far exceeding what he'd stolen from me personally. Kevin found additional evidence on Marcus's business computers, including communications with the organized crime figures, who were pressuring him for gambling debt payment. The messages revealed that Marcus had been promising to resolve his debts, using money he planned to steal from me after our wedding. "Look at this," Kevin said, showing me an email Marcus had sent 3 weeks ago. He told these criminals that marriage to you would give him access to enough money to pay off his gambling debts completely. You weren't just a victim, you were part of his debt resolution strategy. The email detailed Marcus's plan to gain access to my investment accounts and inheritance money after our marriage, then disappear with enough funds to pay his criminal creditors and start over somewhere else. Our June wedding hadn't been a celebration of love. It had been scheduled as the culmination of a complex theft operation. As the search teams concluded their evidence gathering, the scope of Marcus's criminal enterprise was becoming clear. He'd been running a sophisticated fraud operation that targeted multiple victims simultaneously, using gambling addiction as motivation, but organized crime pressure as deadline enforcement. We've recovered enough evidence to support charges for grand theft, fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and racketeering, Detective Park announced as she reviewed the day's findings. Marcus Thompson isn't just a gambling addict who made bad choices. He's a career criminal who's been operating a systematic fraud enterprise. David was clearly pleased with the evidence they'd gathered. "Jessica, this level of documentation makes prosecution almost automatic. Any reasonable prosecutor will pursue maximum penalties when faced with this kind of evidence." As evening approached and Marcus's delayed flight finally landed at San Francisco International Airport, I found myself thinking about the confrontation that would happen when he returned to Riverside. He was expecting to find the same trusting fiancé he'd left behind, completely unaware that his entire criminal operation had been exposed and documented. Kevin insisted on staying with me at the hotel until Marcus was safely in police custody. His protective instincts were clearly activated by the discovery that organized criminals might view me as a target for debt collection. "After tonight, your life is going to be completely different," Kevin said, as we waited for news of Marcus's arrest. "But different in a good way. You're going to be free from someone who was systematically destroying your future." He was right. Tomorrow I would wake up as someone who had survived a sophisticated criminal fraud rather than someone who was unknowingly financing it. The transformation from victim to survivor was already beginning, and with it came a sense of personal power,
I hadn't felt since Tony's phone call had shattered my illusions about Marcus. Detective Park called at 9 p.m. to confirm that Marcus had been arrested at our apartment complex as he returned from his fake business trip. The arrest had gone smoothly, with Marcus showing complete surprise and confusion about the charges against him. He's maintaining his innocence and claiming everything was just poor financial management, rather than deliberate fraud. Detective Park reported, his attorney will probably try to negotiate a plea deal once they see the evidence we've gathered. The arrest represented the end of Marcus's criminal operation, and the beginning of justice for his victim. But more importantly for me, it marked the moment when I stopped being someone who was being systematically betrayed, and became someone who had successfully fought back against that betrayal. As I settled into the hotel room bed that night, I realized that the woman who had answered Tony's phone call 2 days ago was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more aware of how people could manipulate and exploit trust. The transformation hadn't been pleasant, but it had been necessary for survival. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the legal process moved forward, and I began the task of rebuilding a life that had been built on lies. But tonight, for the first time since discovering Marcus's betrayal, I felt safe, protected, and confident that justice would be served. The morning after Marcus's arrest brought a mix of relief and uncertainty that I hadn't anticipated. While I was grateful that he was in police custody and could no longer steal from me or threaten my safety, I was also facing the daunting prospect of navigating a complex legal system while trying to rebuild my personal and financial life from scratch. David Rodriguez had scheduled an early meeting to discuss prosecution strategy and civil recovery options, and I arrived at his office feeling more clear-headed than I had since this nightmare began. Kevin accompanied me, having taken additional time off work to provide technical and emotional support during what he correctly recognized as a crucial phase of the case. Marcus appeared before a judge this morning for his arraignment, David began as we settled into his conference room. He's been denied bail due to the flight risk posed by his gambling debts and criminal associates. The prosecutor is taking this case very seriously. This news was more reassuring than I'd expected. I'd been worried that Marcus might somehow talk his way out of custody and continue threatening me, or other potential victims. Knowing he would remain locked up while awaiting trial provided a sense of security I desperately needed. What happens next in the criminal case? I asked. The district attorney's office will present the evidence to a grand jury within the next few weeks, David explained. Given the documentation we've provided, an indictment is virtually certain. After that, Marcus's attorney will probably try to negotiate a plea deal to avoid going to trial. Detective Park had forwarded copies of additional evidence found during Marcus's arrest, including communications on his phone that revealed the scope of his criminal network.
Marcus's phone contained detailed profiles of over 20 potential victims, including current financial information and relationship status. You weren't his only target. The revelation that Marcus had been simultaneously targeting multiple women for financial exploitation was disturbing but not entirely surprising. Someone sophisticated enough to maintain the level of deception I'd experienced was clearly operating on a larger scale than just our relationship. Have law enforcement contacted the other potential victims? I asked Detective Park, who had joined our meeting to coordinate between the criminal investigation and civil recovery efforts. We're in the process of reaching out to everyone identified in Marcus's files, she confirmed. Several of them have already come forward with similar stories of financial fraud and identity theft. This is shaping up to be one of the largest financial fraud cases Riverside County has prosecuted. The idea that other women had suffered similar betrayals made me feel less isolated in my experience, but it also highlighted the calculated nature of Marcus's criminal enterprise. He hadn't targeted me impulsively or emotionally. I'd been carefully selected based on specific criteria that made me an ideal victim for his type of fraud. David spread out a series of legal documents across the conference table. Beyond the criminal case, we need to discuss civil recovery. Marcus has very few legitimate assets, but there are several avenues we can pursue to recover at least some of your stolen money. The civil recovery process was more complex than I'd anticipated. While the criminal case focused on punishment and justice, civil recovery required identifying and claiming assets that Marcus might have hidden or transferred to avoid restitution requirements. We've identified 3 potential sources of recovery, David explained. First, Marcus had a substantial life insurance policy that we can claim against. Second, there are business assets from Thompson & Associates that can be liquidated. Third, some of the money he stole can be traced to specific accounts that haven't been completely empty. Kevin's technical expertise proved valuable in tracing the digital money trail Marcus had created to hide his stolen funds. He was more careless with digital security than most criminals, Kevin observed. I can trace most of the transfers he made from your accounts to their final destination. The insurance policy was particularly significant because Marcus had listed me as the primary beneficiary, probably as part of his strategy to appear financially responsible and committed to our relationship. The policy was worth $50,000 and couldn't be changed without my consent, providing one guaranteed source of recovery. What about the gambling debts he owes to organized crime figures? I asked. Will they try to claim any recovered money before I can get it back? Detective Park's expression grew more serious. That's a legitimate concern. Criminal creditors often try to intimidate fraud victims into surrendering recovered assets to pay gambling debts. However, legally they have no claim to money that was stolen from you. David added additional context about the criminal creditors. We've shared information about Marcus's organized crime connections with federal law enforcement. There may be a larger investigation into illegal gambling operations that could provide additional protection for victims. The federal investigation angle was something I hadn't considered, but it made sense given the interstate nature of Marcus's activities and the involvement of organized crime figures. If federal agencies were targeting the criminal network Marcus had been working with, it might provide additional security for me and other victims. As our meeting continued, Maria brought in additional documentation that had arrived from the district attorney's office. The prosecutor assigned to Marcus's case wanted to meet with me to discuss my testimony and ensure I understood the court process. Victim testimony is crucial in financial fraud cases, David explained. The jury needs to understand not just the technical aspects of the crimes, but the personal impact on the people who were victimized. The prospect of testifying against Marcus in open court felt daunting, but I recognized its importance for ensuring justice and preventing him from victimizing other people in the future. My testimony would help establish the pattern of deliberate deception that separated Marcus's actions from simple financial mismanagement. Kevin interrupted our legal discussion with a discovery from his analysis of Marcus's digital records. Jessica, I found something you need to know about. Marcus has been communicating with someone at your workplace, probably gathering information about your income and employment stability. This revelation sent a chill through me. If Marcus had corrupted someone at Pacific Tech Solutions, my job might be compromised along with everything else in my life. The thought of losing employment security on top of everything else felt overwhelming. Do you know who at Pacific Tech he was in contact with? I asked. Kevin showed me email exchanges between Marcus and someone using the initial BM from a Pacific Tech email address. The communications included requests for information about my salary, benefits, and relationship with management. BM could be Brad Mitchell. I realized he works in human resources and would have access to exactly the kind of information Marcus was requesting. But why would Brad help Marcus spy on me? Detective Park made notes about the potential workplace accomplice. We'll need to investigate whether this person was paid for providing information or was manipulated into helping without understanding the criminal context. The possibility that someone at my workplace had been feeding information to Marcus added another layer of violation to his betrayal. My job had been one of the few areas of my life that felt secure and untainted by his deception, but apparently even that hadn't been safe from his manipulation. David recommended that I request a meeting with Pacific Tech's legal department to discuss the situation and ensure my employment wasn't compromised by Marcus's criminal activity. Most employers are very supportive of employees who are victims of criminal fraud, especially when it involves workplace information security. As our legal strategy session concluded, I felt more prepared for the challenges ahead, but also more aware of how extensive Marcus's criminal operation had been. Every aspect of my life had been touched by his deception, in ways I was still discovering. The next few months are going to be difficult, David warned as we wrapped up. Criminal prosecution moves slowly, and civil recovery can be even slower. But you have strong legal representation, solid evidence, and a support system that will help you through the process. Kevin would be returning to San Jose that afternoon, but he'd arranged to work remotely for the next few weeks so he could continue providing technical support for the investigation. Having his expertise available had been invaluable, and knowing he would remain involved provided additional security. As I prepared to leave David's office, Maria handed me a folder containing contact information for victim support services and financial counseling resources. Recovery from financial fraud involves more than just legal action, she explained. These services can help you rebuild your credit, develop new financial security measures, and process the emotional impact of what you've experienced. The emotional support resources were something I hadn't considered but clearly needed. While I'd been focused on the practical aspects of stopping Marcus and recovering my money, I hadn't fully processed the psychological impact of discovering that someone I loved had been systematically betraying me for years. Walking to my car in the parking garage, I reflected on how much my life had changed in just 3 days. On Monday morning, I'd been planning a wedding and looking forward to building a future with someone I thought I knew. By Thursday afternoon, I was coordinating with law enforcement, planning testimony against a criminal enterprise, and trying to rebuild a life that had been built entirely on lies. The woman who had answered Tony's phone call about her pawned engagement ring was gone forever, replaced by someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more aware of how predators operated in the modern world. The transformation hadn't been pleasant, but it had been necessary for survival and recovery. That evening, as I settled into my temporary hotel room, my phone rang with a call from an unknown number. For a moment I hesitated, wondering if it might be Marcus calling from jail, or one of his criminal associates trying to intimidate me. But something made me answer. Jessica Chen. The voice was female, nervous, and unfamiliar. Yes, this is Jessica. Who's calling? My name is Jennifer Walsh. I think we need to talk. The name hit me immediately. Jennifer Walsh was the woman who had filed the restraining order against Marcus 2 years ago, the previous victim, whose experience had been documented in court records. Detective Park had mentioned trying to contact her for witness testimony, but I hadn't expected her to reach out to me directly. Jennifer, yes, I've heard about what Marcus did to you. I'm so sorry you went through that. I'm sorry you're going through it now, Jennifer replied. When the police contacted me about testifying in his criminal case, I realized there might be things about Marcus that you should know, things that didn't make it into the restraining order paperwork. Jennifer's call opened up a conversation that would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of Marcus's criminal operation. She suggested meeting at a coffee shop in downtown Riverside the next morning, somewhere public, where we could talk safely about her experiences with the man who had targeted both of us. The next morning, I arrived at Corner Cafe on Main Street to find Jennifer Walsh already waiting at a corner table. She was a woman in her early 30s with short blonde hair and the kind of carefully composed demeanor that suggested she'd spent considerable time recovering from trauma. When she saw me approaching, her expression was both sympathetic and determined. "Thank you for meeting me," Jennifer said, as I sat down across from her. "I know this must be incredibly difficult for you right now. Thank you for reaching out," I replied. "I feel like I'm still discovering the extent of what Marcus was doing. Anything you can tell me about his patterns might help me understand what I was really dealing with." Jennifer ordered us both coffee and then began sharing her story with Marcus, filling in details that court records hadn't captured. Her experience revealed a pattern of manipulation and exploitation that was even more sophisticated than what I'd discovered about my own situation. Marcus targeted me specifically because I'd just received a substantial inheritance from my grandmother, Jennifer began. He somehow learned about the inheritance before we even met, and our entire relationship was built around gaining access to that money. The parallels to my own experience were chilling. Marcus had clearly been researching potential victims' financial situations before initiating relationships, using public records and social networks to identify women with assets worth stealing. "How did he find out about your inheritance?" I asked. "That's one of the things that really disturbed me," Jennifer replied. "He had information about my family's finances that should have been private: bank account balances, investment holdings, even details about my grandmother's estate that weren't public record. This suggested that Marcus had access to financial information through illegal means, possibly involving identity theft or computer hacking, that went beyond what I'd discovered about his activity. The technical sophistication of his criminal operation was apparently much greater than even Kevin had realized. Jennifer continued her account, describing how Marcus had courted her with elaborate romantic gestures while systematically gaining access to her financial account. He convinced me to add him to my bank accounts after only 3 months of dating, claiming it would make our relationship more serious and committed. The speed with which Marcus had gained financial access in Jennifer's case was faster than in mine, suggesting he'd refined his techniques over time to become more efficient at exploiting victims. By the time he targeted me, he'd learned to be more patient and subtle in gaining trust and access. The most disturbing part, Jennifer said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, was discovering that he'd been photographing and copying my personal documents while I slept: bank statements, tax returns, insurance policies, anything that contained financial information. This revelation made me realize I should check my own personal documents to see if Marcus had been conducting similar surveillance in our apartment. The locked filing cabinet we'd found might have contained copies of my private financial records that I'd never given him permission to access. Jennifer pulled out a folder containing documents she'd brought to share with me. These are copies of some communications I found after Marcus disappeared with my money. I think they'll help you understand how organized his criminal operation really was. The documents Jennifer showed me revealed that Marcus had been part of a larger network of criminals who specialized in what they called romantic fraud. They shared information about potential targets, techniques for gaining financial access, and strategies for avoiding prosecution when victims discovered the theft. There were at least 5 other men working with Marcus, Jennifer explained. They called themselves financial recovery specialists, and claimed they were helping gambling addicts pay off debts by finding willing partners to provide financial assistance. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what was clearly a systematic criminal enterprise. Marcus and his associates had created an organized system for identifying, targeting, and exploiting women for financial gain, using romantic relationships as cover for sophisticated theft operations. One document particularly caught my attention. It was an email exchange between Marcus and someone identified only as coordinator discussing target selection criteria. The conversation revealed that they preferred women with stable employment, limited family connections, and previous relationship difficulties that might make them more vulnerable to manipulation. I fit their target profile perfectly, I realized aloud. Stable job, dead parents, history of relationship problems. They weren't just randomly selecting victims, they were using psychological profiling to find women who would be easiest to manipulate. Jennifer nodded grimly. That's exactly what I conclude. Marcus didn't fall in love with us and then decide to steal our money. He identified us as targets and then created relationships specifically designed to facilitate theft. She showed me additional documents that detailed the network's financial operation. They had established systems for laundering stolen money through shell companies and cryptocurrency exchanges, making recovery extremely difficult even when victims discovered the theft quickly. This is why the police and FBI are so interested in Marcus's case, Jennifer explained. He's not just a gambling addict who made bad choices, he's a member of a criminal organization that's been operating across multiple states for several years. The federal investigation angle that Detective Park had mentioned was apparently much larger than I'd realized. Marcus's arrest might be part of a coordinated effort to dismantle an entire criminal network that had been victimizing women across the country. Have you been contacted by federal investigators? I asked Jennifer. Yes. Just last week. They're building a racketeering case against the entire network, and they need victim testimony to establish the pattern of organized criminal activity. This meant my involvement in the case would likely extend beyond local prosecution of Marcus to federal charges against multiple defendants. The scope was both encouraging, because it meant serious resources were being devoted to stopping these criminals, and intimidating, because it suggested months or years of legal proceedings. Jennifer had additional practical advice,
based on her experience recovering from Marcus's fraud. The financial recovery process is slower and more complicated than you expect, she warned. Even when you can prove theft, actually getting money back requires patience and persistence. She'd eventually recovered about 60% of what Marcus had stolen from her, but only after 2 years of legal proceedings and civil collection efforts. The process had been emotionally exhausting and had required rebuilding her entire financial life from scratch. The hardest part isn't the money, Jennifer said. It's learning to trust your own judgment again after discovering that someone you loved was manipulating you so completely. This observation resonated deeply with my own experience. While the financial theft was devastating, the psychological damage of realizing I'd been systematically deceived was even more profound. Marcus hadn't just stolen my money, he'd stolen my confidence in my ability to recognize truth from fiction in intimate relationships. How did you handle the emotional recovery? I asked. Therapy helped a lot, Jennifer replied. Specifically working with someone who specialized in trauma from financial abuse. It's a specific type of betrayal that requires specialized understanding to process effectively. She recommended a therapist named Dr. Jessica Chen, who had extensive experience helping victims of financial fraud and romantic manipulation. Dr. Chen understands how this type of abuse affects your ability to trust yourself and others. She can help you rebuild emotional security alongside financial security. As our conversation continued, Jennifer shared insights about testifying in criminal cases and dealing with defense attorneys who would try to minimize Marcus's culpability by portraying him as a gambling addict rather than a calculating criminal. They'll try to make him seem sympathetic, Jennifer warned. They'll emphasize his addiction and claim he never intended to hurt anyone. But the evidence shows this was systematic, organized crime, not impulsive behavior driven by addiction. The distinction was important for ensuring appropriate punishment and preventing Marcus from using addiction as an excuse for criminal behavior. The detailed planning and coordination I'd discovered in his records clearly showed calculated criminal intent, rather than impulsive theft, driven by desperation. What happened to the other men in the criminal network? I asked. Most of them are still operating, Jennifer said grimly. The FBI investigation is ongoing, but it's a complex case that requires extensive evidence gathering. Marcus's arrest might finally provide the breakthrough they need to prosecute the entire organization. This meant that even after Marcus was convicted and imprisoned, other members of his criminal network would still be targeting women for financial exploitation. The case was bigger than just seeking justice for what had happened to me. It was about preventing future victims from experiencing the same systematic betrayal. As our meeting concluded, Jennifer gave me her contact information and encouraged me to reach out whenever I needed support from someone who truly understood what I'd experienced. The isolation is one of the worst parts, she explained. Most people can't understand how someone could be deceived so completely by someone they trusted. Jennifer's support and understanding proved invaluable as I continued navigating the legal proceedings against Marcus. Her experience provided a roadmap for what to expect during the prosecution and recovery process, while her emotional insights helped me process the psychological impact of discovering such extensive betrayal. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Assistant District Attorney Monica Vega with an update on Marcus's case. The grand jury had returned indictments on multiple felony charges, and federal prosecutors had also filed racketeering charges as part of their larger investigation into the criminal network. Marcus's attorney has approached us about a plea deal, Ada Vega explained during our phone conversation. They're offering to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of 7 years in federal prison plus full restitution to all victims. The plea offer was both satisfying and frustrating. 7 years seemed like appropriate punishment for the extent of Marcus's crimes, but I'd been hoping for a trial that would fully expose his criminal operation and provide closure through public accountability. What do you recommend? I asked. The plea deal guarantees conviction and significant prison time, Ada Vega replied. Going to trial always involves risk, even with strong evidence. However, the decision ultimately belongs to you and the other victim. David Rodriguez helped me understand the implications of accepting versus rejecting the plea offer. A plea deal would provide faster resolution and guaranteed restitution requirements, but a trial would create a public record of Marcus's crimes that might help prevent future victims. After consulting with Jennifer and the other victims who had been identified, we collectively decided to recommend accepting the plea deal. The guaranteed conviction and restitution were more important than the symbolic value of a public trial, especially since the federal investigation would continue targeting the other members of Marcus's criminal network. Marcus's sentencing hearing took place on a gray November morning in federal court in Los Angeles. I attended with Kevin and David, wanting to see the final resolution of the case that had transformed my life so completely. Marcus looked smaller and more defeated than I remembered, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs rather than the expensive suits he'd worn while maintaining his facade of success. When he turned to look at the victims section of the courtroom, our eyes met briefly, and I saw recognition and what might have been genuine remorse in his expression. The judge sentenced Marcus to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. He was also ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, though the judge acknowledged that full financial recovery was unlikely given Marcus's lack of legitimate assets. During the victim impact portion of the hearing, I read a statement describing how Marcus's fraud had affected my life and financial security. The defendant didn't just steal my money, I concluded. He stole my trust in my own judgment and my confidence in building intimate relationships. The financial damage can be repaired over time, but the emotional damage will take much longer to heal. Marcus's attorney asked if he could address the victims directly, and the judge allowed him to speak. "I know that nothing I say can undo the harm I've caused," Marcus said, his voice barely audible in the large courtroom. "I want you to know that my feelings for you were real, even though my actions were unforgivable. I hope someday you can find peace and happiness despite what I did to you." His statement felt inadequate and self-serving, but I recognized it was probably the closest thing to genuine accountability I would ever receive from him. The Marcus who had proposed to me with my grandmother's ring was gone, replaced by someone who would spend the next 7 years in federal prison, contemplating the consequences of his choices. After the sentencing, Jennifer and I met for coffee to discuss our experiences with the legal process and our plans for moving forward. The formal conclusion of the criminal case felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another in our recovery process. "How do you Jennifer asked as we sat in the same coffee shop where we'd first met to discuss Marcus's criminal operation. "Relieved," I replied honestly, "and grateful that it's finally over, but also uncertain about what comes next." The past 8 months had been focused entirely on stopping Marcus and seeking justice for his crimes. Now I faced the challenge of rebuilding a life that had been completely disrupted by his fraud and betrayal. 6 months after Marcus's sentencing, I was settled into a new apartment in a different part of Riverside, working for a new company that had offered me a significant promotion, and slowly rebuilding the financial security he had destroyed. The insurance money and partial restitution had provided a foundation for recovery, though complete financial restoration would take several more years. I'd also begun working with Dr. Jessica Chen to process the emotional impact of Marcus's betrayal and develop healthier patterns for future relationships. The therapy was helping me understand how Marcus had exploited specific vulnerabilities, and teaching me to recognize manipulation tactics that might be used by future predators. My relationship with Kevin had grown stronger through the crisis, and he'd introduced me to several colleagues from his cybersecurity work who had become close friends. Having a social network that understood the technical aspects of financial fraud had been invaluable in rebuilding my confidence and sense of security. The federal investigation that had begun with Marcus's arrest had ultimately resulted in indictments against 12 members of the romantic fraud network, with trials scheduled to continue for the next 2 years. My testimony would be required for several of those trials, but I felt prepared to face that responsibility. Jennifer had become one of my closest friends, bonded by our shared experience but also by genuine compatibility and mutual support. We'd started a victim support group for people recovering from financial fraud, providing the kind of understanding and practical assistance that traditional support systems often couldn't offer. On a warm spring evening, exactly 1 year after Tony's phone call about my pawned engagement ring, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment looking out over the Riverside skyline. My grandmother's ring was locked in a safety deposit box rather than on my finger, but someday I hoped to wear it again as a symbol of survival rather than betrayal. The woman who had answered that phone call was gone forever, but the woman who had replaced her was stronger, smarter, and infinitely more aware of her own value and resilience. Marcus had intended to destroy me for his own financial gain, but instead he had inadvertently created someone capable of helping other women avoid similar predators. My phone buzzed with a text message from Kevin. "Proud of you, sis. Mom and Dad would be too." I smiled, knowing he was right. The parents I'd lost 5 years ago had raised me to be strong and resilient, qualities that had ultimately allowed me to survive Marcus's systematic betrayal and emerge stronger on the other side. The future stretched ahead of me, uncertain but full of possibilities that belonged entirely to me. No one would ever again have the power to steal my dreams or destroy my security without my knowledge. The lessons Marcus had taught me through his betrayal were painful but valuable, and I intended to use them to build a life that was truly my own. As the sun set over Riverside, I felt a sense of peace and closure that had eluded me throughout the legal proceedings and recovery process. Justice had been served, lessons had been learned, and the next chapter of my life was ready to begin. The engagement ring that had started this journey was safe in a bank vault, waiting for the day when I might choose to wear it again as a symbol of love rather than deception. But for now it was enough to know that I had survived, recovered, and emerged stronger from an experience that could have destroyed me. Marcus Thompson was in federal prison, his criminal network was being systematically dismantled, and women across the country were safer because victims like Jennifer and me had found the courage to fight back against sophisticated predators.